welcome. Thank you for coming. This is one of the events run by the Technology and Democracy Project that David Runciman and I run at CRASSH. The purpose of the project is to try and figure out what digital technology means for democracy. Big question, which has recently become strangely topical, and we will no doubt learn more. It's really nice that today's event features a really interesting person in this story. Tim O'Reilly had this idea many years ago that maybe this technology might be very good for printed books. And guess what? As far as he's concerned, it was. How many people here have one of his books? Okay. It's a bit like Bach had this. Johann Sebastian Bach had this thing of the well-tempered clavier. Well, I think the well-tempered geek has some O'Reilly books. When I was preparing for this, I looked in my bookcase, which is an extensive collection of O'Reilly books, and I found this. In 1992, it says, the title is The Whole Internet, The Whole Internet. User Guide and Catalog. Publisher, O'Reilly and Associates. Okay. So I'm not going to say much more because we've got somebody here, Bill Janeway, who knows Tim well, and we'll introduce him. Tim will speak for about 45 minutes. We will then have some Q&A and hopefully some argument. And then we'll go home.
Yeah, let me here.
Introduction, since from that show of hands, Tim is definitely somebody who needs no introduction. I just say, Tim was born ahead of the curve, and the curve has been trying to catch up for a substantial number of years. Our relationship goes back to when this became GNN, the Global Network Navigator, the first way that mere mortals could get online, while Tim Berners-Lee was fiddling at CERN about what became the World Wide Web. That was '93. And then we met at that point, and through the great dot-com bubble, O'Reilly Media became a really significant business, and then did the most remarkable job of reinventing itself in the context of the bus. So I can speak for Tim, not just as a visionary guru of all things digital, but as someone who has lived the economic, commercial, business consequences of living at the frontier. So I would close the introduction by saying, off this, you will come away with two requirements. One is, you're going to really want to buy the book, for which this is the teaser. And second, you got to go to the O'Reilly website and see what has happened to Safari O'Reilly and access to what the alpha geeks are doing now that is going to change your lives tomorrow. Tim, over to you.
Thanks. Let me start with a small correction. First, I will say that my reputation exceeds me. But to Bill's comment about Tim Berners-Lee, a lot of what I have done over the years is actually just be good at recognizing interesting things that were happening early on and make sense of them to the world. And so Tim had started working with the World Wide Web in 1989. When we discovered it and actually made it public in '91. When we discovered it in '92, it was just like, even though there were only a couple of websites, we said, this is super important. We made it a centerpiece of that book, The Whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog, and that's how many people learned about the web. But we also were the first people who said, oh, wait, this could become a commercial thing. We launched the first commercial website. It was the first ad-supported site on the net, not advertising as we know it today. But a lot of what I've done has simply been follow in the footsteps of real innovators. And the core mission of my company, as we like to describe it, is changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. So we do our own attempt to innovate, but mostly we find interesting people like you, and we try to make sense of what you're doing and tell the world about it, and then try to accelerate it. So I've been thinking a lot lately about the intersection of technology and the economy. And it's clear that technology is interpenetrating more and more of our world. At the outset of this trip, I was just at a family reunion in Ireland, but so it was several weeks ago. I spoke out loud to a device in my kitchen, and I asked it if my flight was on time. And then I told it to call me a Lyft. That's the more user-friendly, or I should say more driver-friendly equivalent to Uber. That's unfortunately not over here in the UK. And your car showed up. You know, before long, we might see that car driving itself. You know, anybody might say, WTF? You know, and that would be this expression of wonder. Of course, WTF stands for, what's the future? It's also an expression of curiosity. And, but a lot of people are hearing the news about the future, and they're saying WTF in a very different tone of voice. It's not an expression of wonder, it's an expression of dismay and anger. And we have to come to grips with the fact that the technologies that we are creating in the computer industry are not necessarily making the world a better place. And what I've been trying to do is to come up with a set of ideas about what we have to do differently. And that's led me away from technology into thinking about a lot of other topics in economics and government and so on. So it's very relevant, I hope, for this lecture series. So, you know, people are afraid because they hear, for example, researchers at Oxford telling them that 47% of jobs are at risk of being automated. You know, they see articles like this one saying self-driving trucks are going to wipe out all the trucking jobs. You know, they hear that we may need universal basic income because there will be nothing left for people to do. We just gonna have to just hand out money. I actually think there's something very wrong with that idea, and it has nothing to do with technology. It has to do with the mistaken idea that the goal of technology is to maximize corporate profits, even if that means treating people as a cost to be eliminated. You know, the fact is, yes, productivity matters, but productivity in service of what? I think productivity should be designed to make us all more wealthy, and at its best, that's what it does. And, but instead, what we see is that increasingly, the productivity brought to us by the latest generation of machines has been going increasingly to corporate profits. This is a graph from, I think it's from James Kwok's book, Economism, showing financial industry profits as a share of US business profits. And you see it just climbing up and up and up because we're optimizing our economy for financial outcomes, not for real world outcomes. And a lot of what I've been coming to grips with is this is not a technology problem. You know, increased productivity is the source of wealth, but when it's just used to drive so-called shareholder value, the rest of society suffers. You know, we had this idea, which took hold in the 70s, that if we simply rewarded shareholders and aligned the interests of management with shareholders, that wealth would trickle down to society, but that didn't happen. You know, Facebook had an idea too. They had the idea that if we just rewarded engagement with their algorithm, it would get people all the stories that they really wanted. But somehow fake news crept in. And the algorithms have had to be tuned. We're in a battle to try to figure out how do you get that to work correctly. And just as Mark Zuckerberg is sitting there with his team trying to say, how do we make Facebook get back to its original vision? How do we make that idea that the world is better when it's more social, you know, throw off fake news? How do we build real community? If you've read his manifesto, and he's out on a listening tour in the US, he wants to say, how do we make Facebook do what I really wanted it to do? And that's what we really have to do here too. We have to ask, is our economy doing what we really want it to do? How do we make it better? What can we learn from the way technology works and the way technology projects are learning machines, getting better all the time? What can we learn from that we can apply to politics and the economy? So when we optimize only for corporate profits, we have a problem. A lot of people are worried about AI somehow stealing the jobs. But Andy McAfee, who's the co-author with Eric Brynjolfsson of the book The Second Machine Age and a new book coming out called Platform Machine Crowd, told me over breakfast one time, he said, the people will rise up before the machines do. And we have this looming crisis, which is not a crisis of technology. It's a crisis of misapplied technology. Now, we've seen this happen before. Everybody knows about the Luddite Rebellion, so-called. Ned Ludd is actually a mythical character, but these guys took up the banner of Ned Ludd, and they smashed the machine looms that they thought were stealing their livelihood. And they were right to be afraid, because the next few decades were pretty tough. The first part of the Industrial Revolution, the benefits of productivity had not yet spread, and people were put out of work. It was disruptive. But those weavers couldn't imagine, they could not imagine that their children and great-grandchildren would have food that only kings could have, that they would have more clothing than the kings and queens of Europe, that it would be so cheap and abundant. And that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would have these amazing jobs creating this world of the future. They couldn't imagine that we literally build buildings a half-mile high in the desert. If you ever go up in the Burj in Dubai, it's sort of astonishing. You look down and you go, oh, this is just planted in the desert. It's this astonishing accomplishment. We dug a tunnel. They couldn't imagine that we'd dig a tunnel to France. They couldn't imagine we'd fly through the air, that we'd go into space. These were all big, amazing things that were made possible by the descendants of those machines that they were smashing. And that happened because we kept putting that technology to work on hard problems and creating new possibilities. And we have to keep doing that. The problem was that those in power couldn't imagine that the people would rise up. And that's the problem we have today. It's a great line from Bill Janeway. We were talking about this, and he said, the laws of welfare economics assert that when some people are made better off as the result of an economic change, the winners must compensate the losers. But unfortunately, the winners rarely do so except as the result of political coercion. And that's what we saw. Obviously, there was the French Revolution. Think about this period after the Industrial Revolution. There was a century of revolutions and warfare and struggle, all the way through the Russian Revolution. And, so it's very hard when people who should know better don't learn from history. The American writer Mark Twain once said, the only thing or actually maybe it's not Twain. Who is it who said the only thing we learn from history is that people don't learn from history? But there's another great one, which is the only thing we learn from history is that it doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. But anyway, so what is our failure of imagination? What are we not understanding today? And I think that the biggest thing that we have to rediscover in our economy is expressed to me by my friend Nick Hanauer, who was the first non-family investor in Amazon. It's not technology that wants to eliminate jobs. That's what we've been telling it to do. Technology is the solution to human problems. He said, we won't run out of work till we run out of problems. So if we focus on work instead of on jobs, if we focus on work, what needs doing, instead of on corporate profits, we actually have the opportunity to make a better economy. So are we done yet? Have we solved all the world's problems? I don't think so. Why are we wasting time diddling around with an economy that could be much more productive? And it's really the mechanisms that we have built are not doing what they are supposed to. And I think we need, as a society to come to grips with the fact that, no, they're not working. Just like when Google was getting spammed with low-quality search results, they had to tune their algorithms. When Facebook is getting spammed with fake news, they have to tune their algorithms. Well, policymakers need to figure out how to play that game and tune out the algorithms that rule our society and get involved in the economy in a way that I think we've lost sight of. So obviously there are enormous grand challenges that technology can help us solve. Climate change is coming at us. We have to rebuild infrastructure. There's a demographic inversion coming in many developed countries with lengthening lifespans of older people, smaller number of young workers. We have income inequality. We have displaced people. How do we turn all those displaced people into settlers rather than refugees? There's all kinds of amazing problems. Technology, when it's applied correctly, does this. Look at this chart from Our World in Data. That's life expectancy, from 1543 to 2011. And you can see that it's really in the middle of the Industrial Revolution is when that started to accelerate. And you can see all these additional countries that came on stream. This is an interactive explorer. You can add different countries and watch when they join this accelerating economy. That's wonderful. That's what technology can and should do for us. And if it's not doing that, that's a failure of the rules that we are using to guide it. It's a failure of what we are telling it to do. That's what it's for. It's for making that graph go up and to the right. Now, of course, but does progress always go up and to the right? We have people like Ray Kurzweil tell us that this is inevitable, that we'll just get to the singularity, that somehow this progress happens, and this goes back, the idea of the singularity goes back to John von Neumann, who said the accelerating progress of technology and changes in the mode of human life give the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race, beyond which human affairs as we know them cannot continue. And Kurzweil sort of turned this into this idea that progress is exponential, and this exponential will inevitably lead us to this great transformation. I say progress is sigmoidal. These arcs that go up and to the right, they do flatten out, certainly on human life scales. Because, hey, I was trained as a classicist. And I remember that the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul was the largest building in the world for 1,000 years. They were able to build it, and then they weren't. And the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was published in the same year as the American Revolution, looking back at this great civilization that had passed. Now, our civilization could also pass. So this idea of progress always up and to the right, I think, is wrong. We have to actually instead take an idea out of evolutionary biology, which is the idea of fitness landscapes. Fitness landscape is really originally from genetics, the idea that genes contribute to the survival as an organism. You can look at it as a landscape of peaks and valleys. And organisms evolve towards fitness peaks, which are adapted to a particular environment. And you can understand when you think about it this way, it's not just one possibility. It's not just going one place. There are peaks, and when conditions change, organisms migrate to a different peak. We're seeing this in evolutionary biology right now with climate change. Organisms are migrating. Different organisms are proliferating. We're seeing this dynamically happen right now. Well, and the idea in fitness landscapes is that when you're on a peak, it's very hard to get to another one. There's no, sort of zip line that takes you, from one to the next. You have to go down before you can come up. And it's often easier for people who are already in the valley to get to the next fitness peak than somebody who's already at the top of one. So technology has this same pattern. You can see it. Microsoft was there at the peak of the personal computer ecosystem. Apple got there at the peak of the smartphone ecosystem. You can argue which is the highest peak, whatever, but you can understand there are different fitness peaks. Google ended up there at the peak of the big data and AI peak. And they got there from the bottom. Microsoft didn't get there. Google got there. You know, Apple got there before Microsoft did. And in my history, I think about this as, you know, the way, for example, we got to Google from the World Wide Web and Linux coming together. Here were these, you know, the little mammals who kind of got up to this new fitness peak while the dinosaur you know, dinosaurs of IBM and even Microsoft were struggling. So, you know, I have sort of, throughout my career, I first gave a talk on this, I think, at Bill's conference at Warburg Pincus in 2003. I was talking about a lot of these ideas, this, you know, that new technology comes along and it lowers the barriers to experimentation. The market explodes because hackers push the envelope. And then once a new company becomes dominant, the market tends to stagnate. And we've watched this again and again. You know, almost in some ways, my entire career is watching history rhyme. You know, IBM, you know, built this amazing new computing market. They tried to take too much of the value for themselves. They ended up missing out on this new thing, the personal computer, which they didn't think mattered at first. Microsoft came to dominate that. Microsoft then tried to take too much of the value for themselves. People went off to the internet because, hey, you couldn't make money building PC software anymore. And now we're seeing it repeat as, you know, companies like Google are going, well, you know, we used to send the traffic off to Yelp, but we can actually do a better job delivering results ourselves. And this is actually a really dangerous problem. If you're a company, you have to actually realize, how do you build a healthy ecosystem? And that's one of the things I've been thinking about for a long time. So at the peak, things look pretty good for the incumbents. You know, people keep optimizing for the old way of doing things. You know, Microsoft, well, you know, there was this huge internal battle, you know, where there were some people who were like, go for the internet, and there were other people, no, we got to double down on Windows. And the double down on Windows people won for too long. And I think we're in a similar situation in the economy today. The people who are saying, well, you know, this financial market engineering has been pretty good for us. Let's double down on it. Let's keep doing it. You know, you know, even people who say they're not doing it are still doing it. So, but this issue of people taking too much of the value for themselves means that other people who are down in the valley of the fitness landscape go, well, let's try some other peak because we can't get up there. Right? And this is what's happening in today's economy. This is also true, as we know, in the political realm. Right? You've had that experience that in the UK, and we've experienced it in the US. So the result is voters moving away from the fitness peak of the neoliberal consensus, which is what's good for business is good for the economy, what's good for financial markets is good for the economy. And we don't know where that new fitness peak is yet. But circumstances are telling us that people are migrating away from the set of things that we have believed, that we have been operating on. And it's incumbent on all of us to more consciously seek out the possibilities of the future, to figure out how to build a better society. Because one thing doesn't change. We know that a successful ecosystem creates opportunity for everyone, not just for a few. And if you don't create opportunity for everyone, if you don't make a balanced ecosystem, all the organisms that can't make it are going somewhere else. And economy is a lot like that. And the thing is, though, an economy is a human construct. You know, part of it, unlike natural phenomena, we write rules for how an economy works. And we take those rules so for granted that we forget that we wrote them. We think it just works that way. And I find a lot of times in discussions with particularly free market economists, they're sitting there kind of going, well, this is just the way, these are the laws of economics. There are no laws, there are rules. Now, there are laws such as population growth, productivity, so on, but there's so much that is arbitrary, so much that is changeable. And it's a lot like, in many ways, I keep coming back to this, it's a lot like what we see in the management of algorithmic systems like Google and Facebook. We have a set of rules, and we have to ask ourselves, are they giving us the outcome that we want? So, you know, I basically wrote a blog post, you know, a couple of years ago called "To Survive, the Game of Business Needs to Update Its Rules." And this is a lot of what my book is about. I believe that we will create the economy of the future when we remember that the function of technology is to empower people to do things that were previously impossible. You know, what did we do with that first industrial revolution? We did amazing things. You know, we got there the hard way, and we'll probably get there the hard way again, unfortunately. But if we make the right choices, we can accelerate the progress towards a better future, because we are building amazing technology that can change the world for the better if that's what we tell it to do. And so, you know, my, you know, kind of calling card and talks I've given for the last, you know, 10, 15 years has been work on stuff that matters. One of my proudest moments in Silicon Valley was when an entrepreneur said, you know, I kept trying to think about what my next startup would be, and I would have this idea and that one, and I would say, no, that one fails the Tim O'Reilly test. You know, it was just like, you know, what we choose to work on matters. And that doesn't mean that we have to come up with big world-changing ideas that are idealistic. It means, though, that we need to be solving real problems. And I think that, you know, if you look at, for example, the evolution of something like Uber here was like, well, here's a couple of you know, kind of rich, entitled people who kind of want to have black cars on demand. And it really has morphed into something much more than that. And I think we can actually see where that is going. And it's going to turn into something really interesting if they don't blow it up first. Anyway, but come on, look around. You know, this is Syria today. But if you have a sense of history, you will know that that is what Italy looked like in 1944, 1945. That's what France looked like. I mean, that's what Germany, if you've ever been to, you know, a place like Dresden, you go, oh my gosh, you know, that's what it looked like. And guess what? We rebuilt it. And I think that understanding what happened after World War I versus what happened after World War II is one of the great historical lessons that we should all take to heart. Because after World War I, the victors punished the losers. After World War I, the returning soldiers were told, look after yourselves, right? And that led to some very bad outcomes. So after World War II, they said, no, let's not make that mistake again. You know, so in the US, for example, we focused on putting GIs back to work. You know, we had the GI Bill, sent them to school, we had housing support, all these kind of things to build a prosperous society. We rebuilt Europe. We taxed ourselves. We spent enormous sums of money as a society to rebuild even our enemies. And it led to 70 years of prosperity. That's an amazing demonstration of the power of choice, right? And you have to ask, how are we going to do that again? So, you know, when I think of this devastation, I also think of it as an opportunity. And it's an opportunity perhaps not directly there because those are still war-torn areas, but we have refugees coming out of these countries. We're putting them in squalid refugee camps. Why aren't we building cities for them? You know, and so I think about, you know, what we did, you know, in the 30s and 40s and 50s to build a better society. How do we do that again today? So, you know, when I see, you know, Alphabet, Sidewalk Labs division talking about, well, we're going to build this digital city. Maybe we'll do it in Toronto. They're trying. I went and talked to Dan Doctoroff, the CEO. I said, why aren't you doing this for refugee camps? These people are still going to be there 20 years from now. Build them a digital city. You know, that would be an amazing opportunity. Solve a real problem. And again, you know, using, you know, what I said about Uber, that's not to say that we can't figure out in a modern context some things that will be really useful there. But I wish that we had more entrepreneurs who were sitting there going, wow, let's do a Marshall Plan for these people. Let's resettle them in a place. Let's think about, here's millions of people who are looking to start over. Let's do it. So climate change. Climate change is going to be for our generation what World War II was for our grandparents and our parents. A challenge that we must rise to. And sometimes I think it's going to be the savior of our economy. So solving hard problems with technology is central to our future. Now, there are all kinds of WTF technologies. You think about CRISPR and gene drives and gene engineering, amazing stuff happening there. You think about what's happening in neuroscience, amazing stuff. But I'm a computer guy, so I'm going to talk about AI and cognitive augmentation a little bit, which is one of these holy smokes WTF technologies that's changing our world. So one of the things that a lot of people worry about is that of the independent AI. Everything from movies like The Terminator to 2001. It's always the self-aware computer that is hostile to humans. I actually think that the dominant design pattern is of humans and machines working together. Now, J.C.R. Licklider, who was the DARPA program manager who originally funded the development of the internet, wrote a paper back in 1960 called Man-Machine Symbiosis. And a wonderful line, he said, the hope is that in not too many years, human beings and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and will process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. Now, that's a guy who was ahead of his time. Also, obviously, Douglas Engelbart was totally focused on this idea of augmentation as well. And this is coming back around. I don't know if you guys know about Elon Musk's Neurallink company. It's a fabulous blog post. And when I say blog post, take that with a grain. It's 36,000 words, so it's about a third of a book. It's very funny. He's got these little cartoons throughout it. But it builds slowly, but it really comes up with kind of like a general theory of how Elon builds businesses. But this idea of brain science is, I think, a really interesting big challenge. But we don't actually have to go that far to see where this vision that Engelbart and Licklider had. Because here's this story that goes back to this talk I gave for Warburg Pincus in 2003, and then also at Amazon. I gave him a talk about von Kempelen's Mechanical Turk. This was really a hoax that traveled around Europe in the, let's see, when was it? It was in the 1790s. So I guess it was sort of 18th, early 19th century. It played against Benjamin Franklin, for example, and Napoleon. Both of them lost to it. Turned out it was a man hidden inside the machine, but it pretended to be an artificial intelligence, a robot chess player. But if you think about it, Google and Amazon are Mechanical Turks. In fact, Amazon has created a product called Mechanical Turk. But this design pattern of humans working inside machines, with machines, in workflows with intelligent machines, is the dominant pattern today, right? It's the fundamental design pattern of internet applications. I first understood this back in the late 90s. I asked one of my authors, the guy Jeffrey Friedel, who'd written a book called Mastering Regular Expressions. And I said, he worked at Yahoo. I said, what do you do all day, Jeff? And he said, I write Perl scripts to match up news stories with ticker symbols for finance.yahoo.com. And I went, oh, and he's using Perl, the programming language, because it's something he's got to redo every day. And I started to understand that software was moving from being an artifact to being a workflow. And when you look ahead at where we are today, you think about something like Uber. This is a system with humans and machines in a complex algorithmic dance. You know, you've got workers augmented by their application. You know, people who, you know, don't have to have the knowledge anymore. They have a smartphone that tells them where to go. Their ability to find you wherever you are, you know, via smartphone. This is an augmentation of the workers, an algorithmic augmentation. Those people are managed by algorithms, right? And all of this is changing the way we start to think. You know, it used to be that these people were mated with machines only inside these sort of information applications like Google. But increasingly, when you look at a company like Uber or the way Amazon is using robots and people and delivery drivers to give you same-day delivery of many products, this is a real new interpenetration of human and machine in a very different way. And by the way, I will say, I heard recently Amazon Flex, which is their equivalent to Uber for delivery services, not for, you know, delivering people. They told me that they expect that within the year they will be bigger than Lyft, which is a significant fraction of the size of Uber in terms of the number of drivers they're using. So very, very interesting, and they're using it to up the game. I think that's a really interesting thing. But I want to talk a little bit about the implications of this new hybrid systems that we're building of human and machine together. So what are the implications? The first one is that the nature of work is changing. I love this comment from Hal Varian, who's Google's chief economist. He said, my grandfather wouldn't recognize what I do as work. And I think there are a lot of things that are changing about work that we have not yet fully understood. And you know, when Hal says my grandfather wouldn't recognize what I do as work, I do wonder if he's really right, you know. But more seriously, you know, how is this possible? McDonald's has 440,000 employees to serve 68 million monthly users. Snap has 300 employees serving 100 million monthly users. Wow, how did that happen? Well, guess what? This is one of today's workers. That's the GitHub page for TensorFlow, right? You have software that is a worker. So many of today's workers are programs, and developers are their managers. So developers are middle managers. Programs are workers. So if we look at a company like Amazon or Google or Facebook, the bulk of the work is done by programs. And the people who work there are managers. In the case of companies like Uber, sometimes the programs are managers for workers. But there's this interpenetration. But when you think about the practice of management today, okay, in this what developers call the build, measure, learn cycle, they're basically every day they are inspecting the performance of their workers. They're giving them feedback in the form of fixes of various kinds. Then they measure them again. They're teaching them how to do a better job. So this has led to a set of really important developments, I think, in business. And I think Amazon is probably the single most important company to study because they have done such an amazing job of thinking through how you build an organization that reflects the organization of the software. So there's a great quote from Werner Vogels. This is a blog post from over 10 years ago. He said, services not only represent a software structure, but also the organizational structure. The big insight that Amazon had that led to the development of Amazon Web Services really came from the idea that Amazon was not an application. It had to be a platform. And the best way to build that platform was to create a set of small services internally, whether they're for other parts of Amazon. You build a service-oriented architecture within the company, and then you open it up to the outside world. And the fact that you were going to open this up to the outside world is a way of keeping yourself honest. And so in this world of humans and machines interpenetrating in a company, you have to actually think about what is the architecture of your application and what is the architecture of your organization as very deeply related. It's an HR consultant named Josh Burson, who's now at Deloitte, who said doing digital is not the same as being digital. So we have to actually start thinking about what does it mean to be a digital organization. And I like to think that, you know, for a long time at O'Reilly, we kept thinking we should do management books. And then I realized, oh, wait, we are publishing management books. This is 21st century management, you know, site reliability engineering. And these books like Thinking in Promises and In Search of Certainty are really about the theory of information infrastructure. And it's not an accident that when the Healthcaregov site in the United States failed, the team that was brought in to fix it was a group of site reliability engineers from Google. Because in some sense, you can't actually implement a program today, even in government, without this infusion of technology. Now, this insight was actually articulated even before that by Tom Steinberg, who started a nonprofit here in the UK called My Society. He said good governance and good policy are now inextricably linked to the digital. And we haven't yet made as much progress on that as I would like, but even in the age of Trump in the US, we are still making progress. So, I work a lot in this area of technology and government through my wife's nonprofit, Code for America, which sends startup teams in to work primarily with cities and states, but she also started something at the federal level called the United States Digital Service. And that's really led us into this world of the reshaping of government. And when Jen was at the White House, she was the deputy CTO under Obama. She did a lot of work with Cecilia Munoz, who was the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council. And they started to work on how you actually develop policy iteratively. Because in technology, we figured out that you actually start with what Eric Ries called a minimum viable product. You basically, which he defines as that product which gives you the largest amount of validated learning about users. And policy, by contrast, is typically just dumped out there. You know, Tom Loosemore, who was the COO of the UK Government Digital Service, which has done a lot of pioneering work in this area, said that one policymaker said, now that I've been working with you, I realize that our typical policy is 500 pages worth of untested assumptions. And, you know, working with Cecilia and the teams at the United States Digital Service, we started to really develop policy iteratively. You know, where rather than saying, okay, you guys go off in your corner, develop your 500 pages of untested assumptions, and then tell the tech team to build it, you're going to build the minimal policy framework. You're going to build an implementation of that and see what happens when real users try it. And there was actually a great example when they were building this college scorecard product, and there were a bunch of people, you know, policymakers who said, hey, you didn't put in that feature that we wanted. And they said, well, yeah, we did put it in, but we tested it with 1,000 college students and none of them used it, so we took it out. And they were saying, well, we want it back in. And Cecilia said, no, 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 this isn't how we should just be developing software. It's how we should be developing policy. If people don't use it, we don't want to build it, right? And so there's some really interesting you know, ways that I think that government can learn from the tech world. And there's been a lot of great creative work. This is starting to become a movement, and I'm very excited about that. And we're continuing to try to bring from the technology world the principles of government. And I have to say, the UK Government Digital Service design principles are a fabulous place to start. I will say that since the new government came in, they kind of took away some of the power of the GDS. And it actually is a little sad, because if you go back in the Internet Archive and you look at the original government design principles, the first one that says start with user needs, it literally had a little asterisk that said not government needs. And they kind of took that out. and it's a little bit sad. But you can go find the original in the Internet Archive and read it the way it was. But it's still progress. And a lot of the work that Jenna's been working on is how do we instrument the operations of government so that we have a learning machine. We've been working a lot with food aid in California right now. And we started out with an app that just gave us information about users, and then we started feeding it into them, because they never had any infrastructure for understanding what their users were doing. Right? So we would, they would say, well, why are they, signing up and then falling off the rolls and reapplying? And we go, well, they got this letter 6 weeks in and they didn't know what it meant, and then we show them the letter and they go, oh, yeah, we better change that, or some percentage of the letters that you send out arrive for appointments arrive after the date of the appointment. They didn't know that, because they weren't following their users. And so we've actually built an app that lets us follow the users and find the choke points in the system. Jen calls this apps to ops. The app is not the reason for doing it. The reason is to gather the data and feed it in so you can change the workflows and processes. So, I think, government statistics, economic modeling, and regulations, they're too slow for the pace and scale of the modern world. I love Jeff Jonas, who was formerly an IBM fellow. He's now left to start a new company. Said, would you cross the street with information that was 5 seconds old? Hal Varian, Google's chief economist, talks about something he calls nowcasting. And of course, big hedge funds are there. They're trying to predict the global economy right now. And they don't wait. There's great data, from government bodies, but it's years old typically. And I think we have to get government to be real time, and we have to start thinking about how do we make the systems that we use to guide the economy and learn about what's going on as alive as technology systems are today, because algorithmic systems are power tools for the mind. So, when the fake news problem, came up, there were a lot of people who immediately went to Facebook has to hire humans to check this stuff. And, Mark was, no, we have to fix the algorithms. And I think that's right. It's not that you don't want humans, but you wouldn't, if there was say, a building falling down, you wouldn't send in a bunch of people with jacks. He would send in a big crane, And, there are 7 billion pieces of content posted to Facebook every day, right? So you imagine, okay, how many fact checkers would you have to hire? Some of you may remember that back in the early days of telecommunications when you actually patched together phone calls, in a big switchboard, somebody did the math and said, oh my God, the entire population will have to become switchboard operators. In fact, that's what we did. We augmented them with electronic switches so that you could actually punch your own destination code in, and my God, phone calls got delivered, again, through the fusion of man and machine, or human and machine. So at internet scale, we have to figure out how the algorithms and the humans are going to work together, in solving that fake news problem. But the question, of course, is, that algorithm is a black box. How do we trust it? John Madison, who's the chief information officer for Kaiser, which is a large integrated health provider in the US, said the great question of the 21st century will be, whose black box do you trust? And I do think that there's a great deal of work to be done on the part of government to think about how do we regulate algorithms? What are the rules by which we make them transparent? And it's not in the old way of saying, well, we're just going to tell you what to do, because often policymakers are just trying to push this back the old way. For example, I think about this a lot in the context of systems like Uber. Well, we're going to tell you they have to be employees. We're going to tell you they have to follow the old rules of taxi cabs. And you go, no. Let's make those algorithms better. Figure out what we're trying to accomplish. And by the way, in this question of algorithms, we have to realize that often it's algorithms versus algorithms. It's a great story from the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, where they realized that a lot of software vulnerabilities are because humans just don't patch the darn thing. So they're trying to develop AIs that can recognize and patch vulnerabilities on their own. And one of the DARPA program managers told me a story from the Grand Challenge in which one of the AI contestants spotted, they had basically planted vulnerabilities that they knew about. One of the AI contestants actually spotted a vulnerability in the software that they had not planted, that they did not know about, and used it to take over another machine. But the really interesting thing was another of the contestants watching this interaction figured it out, patched its own software, and became protected against it. So this is a really interesting point. And a friend of mine said, it takes a machine to get inside the OODA loop of another machine. Now, OODA loop is a concept from fighter pilots. It stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And the idea was this guy, John Boyd, came up with this notion that as a fighter pilot, being more maneuverable was more important than firepower, because if you could actually move faster, you could think faster, you could observe faster, you can actually outperform, and that was the key. And I think the same thing is going to be true. We need to harness algorithms as well as people, because we have to be as fast as the machines that we're trying to manage. So that means that we need a new approach to regulation. One that's akin to an airplane autopilot, focused on outcomes, not on rules. See, because one of the big differences between the regulatory systems that we rely on all the time in technology and the ones that we rely on in politics is that the regulatory systems of politics are typically rule-based. We write down a boatload of rules, and those get longer and longer and longer. I like to say, the U.S. Constitution is, I think, 26 pages. The National Highway Act of 1956, which built the U.S. interstate highway system, which is the largest public works system in history, was, I think, 19 pages. Here's our Healthcare Act, which was such a disaster, was 2,700 pages. Well, overspecified, endless numbers of rules. And instead, we have to actually start thinking about real-time feedback loops. And we have to build systems that are tolerant of failure and react to it. So that picture is up there because of a really interesting story I came across, which from the early days of jet aviation. That's the Havilland Comet, which was the first commercial jet airliner. And after World War II, Britain was poised to dominate the skies with this thing, except these things suddenly just started falling out of the sky. And they did this big inquiry. They realized that it was cracks. And they basically said, OK, we're going to figure out how to fix all the cracks. And they said, we got it done. And then planes kept falling out of the sky. A young engineer at Boeing figured out something different. He said, we don't have to prevent cracks. We have to stop them from propagating. Small cracks are OK. Big cracks, bad. So the idea was, how do we make metal that is tolerant to cracks rather than preventing it entirely? So when I think about regulation, we have to focus on outcomes, has to operate at the speed and scale of the system it's trying to regulate, has to incorporate real-time data feedback loops so it can be responsive, has to be robust in the face of failure. And it has to address the incentives that lead to misbehavior. When you look at fake news, for example, we have to say, oh, well, there's a profit motive. Well, how do we actually understand that and address it? But above all, it has to be constantly refined to respond to ever-changing conditions. OK, last point. I'm running quite long here. I hope this is OK, because we can stop at any point if I'm going too long. I want to say, one of the things that we learn about technology today is that the algorithm is the new shift boss. People are increasingly working for algorithms. When you're a driver for Uber, the app tells you where to go. It figures out how much you're paid. You're rated by other users, but the algorithm adds that up and tells you whether you're going to continue to be employed or not. So, and Uber has done a very interesting job of trying to build a marketplace algorithm that brings more workers into the market when there's more demand, and fewer workers when there's less demand. And that's very different than the algorithms of traditional companies, because they're also managed by algorithm. But they're basically trying to say, okay, well, we need this many workers, so you show up now, you show up now. They don't use a marketplace algorithm. So there's advantages and disadvantages. Uber's problem is that they've optimized their algorithms for users. They're basically saying, we want people to be picked up within 3 minutes. That's their fitness function of their algorithm. So everything is about that. That's how the price gets set, at least in theory. And there's also the question of, well, optimizing for their profit. They're not spending enough time thinking about optimizing for their workers. But if you look at the algorithms of a company like Walmart or probably Tesco, I don't know Tesco really whether they're in the same boat, because there are some employers who are better than others. Their algorithm is entirely about optimizing for corporate profit. They tell people, show up. In fast food, there's a concept which you probably never heard of called the clopen, which is a portmanteau word of close and open. So the place closes at 11, and then they have to be back there at 5 in the morning to open it again, right? And people were assigned the clopen shift. By the way, why is my thing accelerating without being touched? This is a very bad algorithm, and I think it's easier to fix the Uber algorithm than it is to fix the scheduling algorithms of traditional companies. I think the marketplace innovation, I think we really need to look at as sort of like search engines in the age of Alta Vista. Uber is not Google. Uber is Alta Vista, right? But this idea of how do you build a swarming marketplace algorithm that brings people to the work that's needed is a fascinating idea, and I want to see us get better at that. I want us to figure out how we can use it to bring people to bear on interesting problems. And then how do we tune that algorithm? Google basically said, oh, there's all these different factors. There's now hundreds of factors that they use to drive relevance. Well, what if we started guiding our economy in that way? We talk about the invisible hand. The invisible hand is increasingly mediated by technology. Well, let's get good at it. So, think, how do we evolve these current systems towards systems that work? Because there are choices that we make. When I think back on, the Industrial Revolution and mass production, we actually made choices to look after the people. It's sort of interesting because a lot of times you'll hear that there were these good middle-class jobs after World War II. David Rolfe, who's a labor organizer in the US, had this great line. He said to me, God did not make being an auto worker a good job. It was something that through a lot of struggle and good policies, we made those good jobs. And there's no reason why all these service jobs that we're providing in the economy could not be much better jobs as well. That's a choice that we're making as a society. It's not inevitable. So, I think it's really important for us when we think about technology to throw out the idea of inevitability and put back in there the idea of choice and put back in the idea that every algorithm has a fitness function. Let's figure out what the algorithms that rule our society are, and let's get them right. So I think I'm going to kind of skip over the rest of this and go to questions now. Well, actually, I should skip through this last part because lots more to talk about here. You can see, but actually, I will say this. This is a great line. This guy, Paul English, started. He was the founder of Kayak. It's a travel search engine. Now he started a company called Lola Travel, which is basically pairing travel agents with an AI and bots to actually give the best of both. And he said, I want to make humans cool again. And this really is, I think, a key idea, in the future. And this goes back to an idea that I've been exploring for a long time, which is Clay Christensen's idea of the law of conservation of attractive profits, which is that when one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. And that was what led me to the idea of big data and collective intelligence. I said, oh, wait, Microsoft arose because hardware became commoditized. software became valuable. Now open source and the internet are commoditizing software. Something's going to become valuable. I said, well, it's going to be data. And now, AI is commoditizing a lot of things that, we've taken for granted in this economy. Something's going to become valuable, and I think it's going to be better service. And actually, that was something Sam Lesson, who has a personal agent startup, was talking about this also recently. He said, people ask me, how long will it take to replace the Fin operations team with pure AI? And he says, our job isn't automation. Our job is the best experience for our users. And we're going to do that by putting people and machines together so that the people can focus on the things that only people can do. So I'm kind of thinking about that. And I think that's also true when we think about things like self-driving cars. Like everybody forgets that if you have self-driving cars, you can do new things that you could not do before. Maybe we could have house calls again for doctors. And I'm really fascinated by the whole, area of healthcare. Yes, if AI replaces radiologists, let's invest in creating community health workers who can visit people, just like they do. Actually, Partners in Health sends community health workers in undeveloped countries, less developed countries. They train people. They send them to remote villages. What if those people were equipped with AI, AR, and telepresence? You could have a doctor, basically visiting in the home again. We could put people to work, doing something that would create much, much better, more human service. This is the possibility if we do our economy right. And there's a great example of this from a company called Zipline, drones on demand. But what are they delivering? Yeah, they're not delivering Starbucks coffee to people in, high-tech office parks. They said, people are dying in Rwanda because there's no hospital infrastructure. The roads are bad, but it's not that big a country. With 3 drone airfields, we can deliver blood to any location in the country in 15 minutes. So guess what? A postpartum hemorrhage is one of the leading causes of death in Rwanda. They can get blood anywhere in 15 minutes. That's kind of going, wow, let's use technology to do something that was impossible. That's the fundamental technology design pattern. And I think we have to embrace that. And I guess I would just also say that as a learning company, and that's really what we do at O'Reilly, one of the big opportunities is using AI to better match skills and opportunity. There's a fascinating company called Catalyte out of Baltimore. And these guys they have an assessment for programming aptitude. And it's apparently working really well because they're growing. They're now in 5 or 6 cities. They will hire people out of fast food jobs because they take this test and they go, yeah, you could be a programmer. And then what they do is they give them a 6-month training program, and then they give them a 2-year apprenticeship where they actually an IT services firm where they work for the company for 2 years, and then they're good to go. And guess what? That's actually what happened in the Industrial Revolution. The fascinating book by a guy named James Burson called Learning by Doing. And he makes the point that people forget that actually a technology doesn't really take off until there is a critical mass of people who can use it effectively. And all the supporting infrastructure. So in the Industrial Revolution, there's this myth that skilled weavers were replaced by unskilled workers at machines. He looked at the actual productivity data and salary data and said, actually, if you look at how long it took one of those workers to be fully compensated and fully productive, it took about the same amount of time for a supposedly skilled weaver and an unskilled factory worker to become fully productive. And he says that's a pretty good proxy for they just needed, they were just different skills. And so we actually have to train people. And companies have to say, there's a lot of whining, we can't hire the right people. Well, make them, train them, teach them. And I think that's one of the big frontiers. And this is a company that I think is very inspirational. And it's really a lot of what we're about at O'Reilly. We used to be a publishing company. Now we're a learning company. Our Safari platform is increasingly focused on figuring out what skills people need and how do you deliver them. The platform does everything from largest still repository of technology and business ebooks, but also video training, but increasingly live training. We're delivering live training is our hottest product. Point is, figuring out how to make the future better than the past is something that we're all responsible for. And that's really what my book is about. And I think the real key line of the book is the last part of the title. You know, WTF stands for what's the future and why it's up to us. Because guess what? It's up to us to make the right choices to make the future better than the present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you. We have time for some questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. But I also, all right, go ahead.
Our problem was that we forgot to book the lecture theatre until 10 o'clock, so we have to leave. Can I start with a question, which is, I was very struck by the photograph you used of the destruction in Syria.
Yeah.
Okay. And you pointed out that this is what Germany looked like after the war. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, but we know what happened after that. We happened that George Marshall went to the United States Congress and he said, we have eliminated this really evil regime. We have bombed Germany back to the Stone Age. And can I please have X billion dollars in order to rebuild it? Okay. Now, can you imagine that happening now?
Well,
it goes back to my question, which is what's holding us back? There's nothing wrong. The technology has all kinds of possibilities. Yeah. And yet there's something wrong. I mean, you couldn't make this kind of case to the U.S. Congress.
You know, yes and no, because in fact we spent billions of dollars in Iraq. We just spent it very badly. And I think that one of the issues is that government has forgotten how to be effective. You know, we've basically built a system which is ultimately captured by companies. And this is not just government, it's also the NGO sector. There's a woman named Claire Lockhart who wrote a book with Ashraf Ghani called Fixing Failed States. She runs a nonprofit called the Institute for State Effectiveness. And what they found was that a typical NGO consumes the bulk of the money before it ever gets to the people who can actually use it. She tells the story. The book, it's a little bit anemic, but when you talk to her in person, she's just blistering, talking about how, in one particular instance, $80 million became a pile of firewood in Afghanistan. Because each NGO basically took 10% for headquarters, or 10 or 20% for overhead, subcontracted the next one down, who subcontracted the next one down, subcontracted the next one down. That's how a lot of government programs are implemented. They're basically a bunch of bottom feeders who are basically taking that money, consuming it in the pipeline. I often think of that wonderful infographic that Edward Tufte made famous of Napoleon's march to Moscow. You know, where you see the fat line, and it gets thinner and thinner, and then it comes back, and it's tiny. That's how a lot of government aid works today. And I think, we have a very sclerotic system, and I think we have to reinvent it pretty deeply. But yes, and I think the political will isn't there, partly because we don't see it working. And so that's why so much of the focus of what I've tried to work on and have been inspired by what my wife Jenna is working on is, if we want to reverse that dialogue about the failings of government, we have to demonstrate government that actually works.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks very much for your talk. I thought there was a kind of split personality thing going on with the talk there. The first half I felt I was listening to Karl Marx, and the second half I thought I was listening to Cath Sunstein. And in a sense, the segue from the first to the second is interesting, but I'm interested in the first part of the talk in particular, and I guess I'm a cynic and I don't buy it. You said something very radical and revolutionary, which is you thought you could imagine a world in which maximizing shareholder value would no longer hold the rich in thrall, because they'd be looking to their own survival and revolution or whatever else, and they would change their ways. I see absolutely nothing about either our society or our technology that will make that shift happen. And I'll explain it. The rich can retreat into all kinds of privatized spaces, whether it's healthcare, whether it's private security or education. And I see technology making things worse, because what you haven't told us about is the ways in which these new technologies that we're talking about, whether in healthcare, gene therapy, the neural interface, these are not egalitarian technologies. These are technologies that the rich can use to increase their gap between them and the rest of us. So I guess I would love to believe this idea of the enlightened, rich, and powerful, but maybe you could help us understand a bit more how we're going to get there.
Yeah, I will recognize that there is a serious split there. But I guess I would say that there's this wonderful line from Kurt Vonnegut at the end of, actually it's at the beginning of Mother Night, although it's really a judgment from the end. He says, we are what we pretend to be, so we better watch what we pretend. If you've ever read that book, it's a fable about a guy who was secretly a double agent for the United States during World War II, but practiced as a German propaganda minister and is on trial in Israel after the war. And the question is, well, which was he really? And that idea, we are what we pretend to be. But I've always thought you can flip that on its head, and you can pretend to be better than you are. And I think C.S. Lewis actually said something like that. He said sometimes the only way to become what we want to be is to pretend you are before you get there. And I think part of it is there are people who care about these things, who think about these things, who can make these better decisions and are trying to build a better world. And for me, I want to highlight those people. I want to hold up the dream that we can do that. And, you make small progress in that direction. I wouldn't say that I am optimistic, but I'm also would not say that, I wouldn't be continuing to push this if I didn't think that we could rise to the occasion.
Tim, Charles Arthur, recovering journalist. You talked about Google. You said, why don't we use the way Google uses all these signals and so on, why don't we use those to sort of make policy and so on? One of the best examples I came across when I was writing a lot was Google Flu Trends, which actually had an external test of validation to see whether it was correct or not. And it turned out very much not to be correct, that it quickly went off being correct because of all the incipient feedback loops that it had to itself, that it went off in that because of that problem. Isn't that the sort of problem that we face? If we try to let what the data tells us guide what we do without being aware of the errors in the data, that we could just spiral off into something which is even worse than we would want otherwise. Right,
but in fact, if you look at that experiment, Google didn't kind of go, oh yeah, this is the best thing since sliced bread, let's double down on it. They went, okay, it didn't really work. I think there's an awful lot that does work. And I think, part of what we can do is we can look and measure and see if it in fact is effective. This is not like, well, you just turn over the algorithm and go blind. This is, no, we actually keep working at it. And I think the biggest thing that people need to learn about all these algorithms is they're static. They're not static things that you build once. They're workflows that we're continually improving.
Sorry, over here. Hi. If we go back to the charts that you had of adaptation and the peaks and troughs, and you got to go right down before you get back up again. And if one of those was democracy as we have it now, has it peaked? And if it has peaked, how far do we still have to go down before it goes up again?
That's a really good question. I don't know. It certainly could be that we have to go way down. But it's also possible that it's hard to say. I think you can't make a general statement about that. And I guess the thing I would also just say about that is that in our society, we very often think that things must go together. And one of the really important skills that we have to develop is the ability to disentangle ideas. It's a little bit like yoga, which is sort of untangling muscle groups that are stuck together when they could be able to move freely. And I think that, like if you look at the growth of rich societies, we have, for example, this mythology that, well, it's free markets and so on, but there's a fair amount of evidence that the protectionism actually is good for, not for countries like the US, but Korea certainly used it. US used it it used it against Britain early in its career. So there's sort of some really interesting questions in economics and politics about how do we get realignments of ideas. Right now we have pretty toxic alignments, I think, and things have to get unstuck. But once they get unstuck, maybe they can be reframed and reformed.
I like the idea of reactive, real-time policy in government, but there's also a problem with short-termism.
Yeah.
At the moment. Sorry, I'm not sure if everyone heard that. Reactive, real-time government, but we also get things like the Marshall Plan from people who can think really long-term. And is there a sort of optimum time constant or damping factor? If we did make it more real-time, would things become even more short-termist than they are at the moment?
I think that real-time happens within the context of a big long-term objective. And I think the question of getting the right long-term objective is critical. And I think there are great companies that do have long-term objectives. There are great countries that have long-term objectives. And one is a tactic, the other is a strategy.
Tim, I'd like to bring together two reference points. You just spoke about, the Marshall Plan on the one hand, and you talked about climate change on the other. It's very important to remember that 70 years ago, almost exactly 70 years ago, George Marshall gave the commencement address at Harvard in which he outlined the idea of the Marshall Plan. At that very moment, Romania, Poland, and Hungary were becoming communist states under the expanding Soviet empire. The Marshall Plan did not happen purely as a beneficent gesture. It was indeed responsive to what came to be perceived broadly as a legitimate political mission to rebuild Europe before the Russians got there.
Yeah.
Climate change has the potential to represent a legitimate mission for all sorts of government interventions, state action, some of which could be, like putting aerosols up into the stratosphere. So thinking about how do we get from here to there, is it necessary that there be an existential crisis?
No, I think
legitimizes creative response.
Yeah, I would just say climate change is a good example where there are many countries that have already begun to respond, and the competition between countries is in fact going to be an economic competition to deal with it because, hey, it's going to give countries advantage when they do. And we're already seeing that. So, I think all of this it's not at all simple. I think also just the sad twists of fate. I was on holiday in Vietnam earlier this year, and I read a wonderful book called The Ashes of War, about how the U.S.-Vietnam War was kindled in the ashes of the War for Independence of the French. And I had never realized Ho Chi Minh venerated the United States. He had been writing to American presidents since the 1920s, trying to enlist America, which he thought was the natural ally for Vietnam, which wanted independence from colonialism. And somehow, the French managed to convince the U.S. that no, that them taking back their empire was part of this global war against communism, and so you know, and it's funny because all the OSS guys who'd worked with, you know, Ho Chi Minh during the war, you know, freeing Vietnam from the Japanese were like, this is our guy, we should be backing him. But the people in Washington just like, no way, you know, the big red scare took over. And I think this is kind of the sad thing about history is we can get it wrong. And that's why I guess all of us have to be aware that the choices that we make as a society really, really matter. There is no inevitability.
Hi, Tim. I'm just a bit curious. So I keep looking at what's the future. It's up to us. And I actually believe that what's the future, it's up to us 10 years ago is what led to us today. So if you put this up 10 years ago, that's what we got. All right? So the now, which is the future of the past, was up to us, and we did it now. Okay? So this is what we did.
This is what we did,
This is exactly what we did. Right? And so I challenge your assumption there's no inevitability, because I think there is. Actually, I'm actually very optimistic about it, because I think there's enough indignation in the world, disgust in the world, to make the change. And it would get better, maybe. I don't think it will get worse, because I think there's enough horror for people to invent and do something. So my question, I think, is for you, because you obviously wrote this book, and there must be a purpose to this. Assuming I challenge the assumption of inevitability, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to be the alarmist to accelerate something to be better?
No,
I mean,
I think what I'm fundamentally trying to do is to undermine the idea of technological determinism, that effectively, you know, we have all these technologies that can replace humans, can replace human jobs, and therefore they must replace human jobs, with the idea that no, that's really not how we should be using technology. We should be using it to you know, do things that were previously impossible. And I think if you can sometimes put an idea out and it takes hold, it makes a difference. You know, in my book, I kind of trace the history of how the idea of, you know, sort of shareholder, you know, optimizing for shareholder value kind of took hold and really totally reshaped our economy. You know, could we reshape our economy again with the idea that, no, we want to put people to work doing hard things, you know, and that's actually the secret to a successful economy. You know, so I guess I'm trying to put out a counter meme and hope that it will take hold.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a specific question? You mentioned at the beginning that I think you use Lyft, not Uber?
Yeah.
Why?
Because my sense is that, I mean, Lyft allows tipping of drivers. They pay their drivers more. You talk to the drivers of both of them, and they say, you know, they like working for the service more. And you talk to the management at Uber, and they're basically, you know, and you talk to the management at Lyft, and you go, well, one set of these people is idealistic, and the other is not. You know, Logan Green and John Zimmer started Lyft after they were really looking to reinvent public transportation. You know, Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp were looking to make a service, you know, for entitled rich people. It was kind of interesting because a lot of people think, they don't realize what a dance the two companies have been in inventing this future. You know, Uber kind of came up with the idea of the smartphone app to summon the car, which is a super powerful idea. But they were just summoning black cars. I mean, it literally was a service for rich people, right? And meanwhile, Lyft had this idea, originally it was called Zimride, which was basically people just reaching out to peers, you know, for long distance transportation. You know, it was carpooling effectively for inner city transportation. And then they realized, well, maybe we could actually do this locally. And then when they saw what Uber was doing, they basically said, well, let's build this kind of Uber-like service for ordinary people sharing their cars. So they're the ones who invented what we think of as Uber today. You know, technology often progresses in that kind of leapfrog. Uber didn't copy that till a year later. They were very skeptical of the peer-to-peer model. So anyway, I know I know Logan and much better than I know Travis, but Logan, I believe, is a real humane human being and business leader. Yeah. So.
But just while we're waiting for the end, so in fact, you're making an ethical choice when you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and the idea is that you want to nudge the technology in a certain direction.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
John.
So what do you think of Cory Doctorow's Walk Away novel?
So,
that seems Walk Away by Cory Doctorow. I don't know if you've read it yet.
I have not read it yet. I feel really bad because Cory sent me the sent me the galley, and I just haven't been able to get to it. But I do. It's the it's the prequel to Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is one of my favorite books, and incredibly instructive, I think, in many ways about the way the economy could work in the future.
For those who haven't read it, can you summarize it?
So I guess the premise is that the revolution has been the only way that we've actually dealt with the increase in shareholder value, whether it's kings or empires or it's Zuckerberg. The British Empire or the American Empire, whatever. But he proposes a new solution. And so I'm not going to spoil. A spoiler would be to explain what it is, but the title kind of gives you some idea. And I highly recommend it. I mean, the guys, a lot of the backstory is what you just heard. But his solution is rather radically different. So I go for reading it. I think it's
it's on my list, and I know part of it. I had a feeling that if I read it, too much of my book would be about it.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
Well, I'm interested in your faith in the idea that you can use an algorithm to crowdsource stuff for the shortage of capacity. Because one of the critiques one can make of people like Uber is that where there are economic constraints, algorithms can't do the work. If there simply aren't enough cars around, you're stuck. If there isn't enough electricity, well, you know from California capacity markets 15 years ago that broke. What on earth would be needed to crowdsource enough cars during a rainstorm in Singapore? Surely this is a line of criticism that should be developed. Algorithms only go so far, and you come up against real capacity constraints real soon.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that the whole idea of on-demand transportation depends on excess capacity. And I think it is generally true that there is excess capacity in many segments of society, but that doesn't mean it's going to solve every problem. Singapore in a rainstorm, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I look at, for example, if I compare where I live in Oakland, California, and I look at the old regime where government said, all right, we're going to figure out how many taxi licenses there are going to be. And you couldn't get a taxi to save your life in Oakland. You call, you say, I want to go to the airport, and maybe if you were lucky, they would show up. If they didn't, you were out of luck. You'd have to call them 45 minutes in advance, and they might or might not come. And now, routinely, I go to the airport, I just basically summon a car 5 minutes before I want to go, and there it is. There are, probably something like 5 or 6 times as many people providing driving services as there were in the days of taxi cabs, and it's cheaper, and actually the people make just as much money or more money than taxi drivers, and it's structured differently economically. I'm very aware of this because my brother was a taxi driver and has a small taxi fleet. I actually loaned him the money to set it up when he was originally a taxi driver, and interestingly enough, I warned him. I said, "You got to sell your licenses now," and he didn't do it. So I ended up writing off my loans. So I felt the personal pinch of the transformation, but there's no question that it brought new capacity in the market. There was all this idle capacity, and I think there's a lot of idle capacity in our society. And that's really kind of thing that we have to understand. We're sitting here with all these things that could be done with idle capacity, and our current systems are not optimized for putting the capacity to work on the problems that we actually have. And that's a good recipe for saying, hey, let's change the way we're doing things. And I think the new ways of doing things are not figured out yet. But I would much rather go forward into the future than just try to keep reusing the old recipes from the past.
Thank you very much.